Due to the graphic nature of this murder case, listener discretion is advised. This episode includes dramatizations and discussions of murder and assault that some people may find offensive. We advise extreme caution for children under 13.
Jim Yates was born in Toowoomba, Australia on November 2, 1909. By 1960, he was 50 years old and had already accomplished more than most could hope for in a lifetime.
He was a decorated medic in World War II and was responsible for saving incalculable lives. He was one of the most well-regarded surgeons in all of Sydney, and most of all, he lived in domestic bliss with his lovely wife, Diana.
However, on Wednesday, September 14th, that all changed. At around 5 a.m., Diana had found her husband in their garage, laying in a pool of his own blood. He was pronounced dead a half hour later.
And after spending some time at the scene of Jim's death, the police were just as stunned as Diana. The esteemed doctor showed all the signs of a grisly assault, and yet there were no signs of a murder weapon to be found. Nothing pointed to a forced entry, or even so much as a light skirmish. The place was spotless.
However, it wasn't that there wasn't any evidence to be found. They just weren't looking in the right place.
What was first thought to be a household chore gone wrong turned out to be so much more. And to the detective's shock, the twists and turns did not stop there.
With each passing day of the investigation, a web of infidelity, past crimes, and rage began to emerge, and it wasn't long before the death of Jim Yates was all anyone in Australia could talk about. This is our first episode on the murder of Jim Yates, an esteemed Australian surgeon. This week, we'll cover the bizarre twists and turns that occurred during the first few days of the investigation. Next week, we'll discuss the court case that followed and how things only seemed to grow stranger as the case carried on.
We have all that and more coming up. Stay with us.
50-year-old Jim Yates was driving to his house in Sydney, Australia on September 14, 1960. Around 11:30 p.m., he arrived home and parked his bulky sedan in the driveway.
Half an hour later, Jim's neighbor, Ada Smith, was up and stirring about the house when something peculiar caught her eye. She saw Jim's car parked outside with the engine running and headlights shining into the open garage.
It was an odd sight, but she didn't think much of it. She went upstairs to sleep beside her husband, Roy. However, when a coughing fit woke him up at 4:30 in the morning, Roy was surprised to see the car with its engine idling. He picked up the phone.
Hello? Diana?
Yes, it's 4 in the morning. Is everything all right?
I'm not sure. Have you seen Jim? His car's been running outside the garage since midnight.
He never came home. I thought he just had to stay late at the hospital.
Maybe take a look around the house?
Jim? Jim, are you home? Roy, I can't find him.
I'm sure there's an explanation. Do you want one of us to come over?
Yes, please. I'm not sure what to do. I'm worried.
Just sit tight.
Ada dashed across the street where she met Diana. The two then walked in the dark garage with only a gaslit lamp to help them see.
However, as Diana cast her lamplight around her, Ada saw something that made her nearly faint. It was a man's body lying motionless on the ground. Trembling, Diana knelt down and put a somber hand onto the body's back. Ada watched in terror as she lifted the body's head and began to sob.
It's Jim. He's not breathing.
The two of them stood over Jim's dead body for a few minutes, and as the sun began to rise, a small pool of blood around his head became visible. His skull had a massive gash from his forehead all the way to the back of his neck.
A bubble of foam frothed from his mouth. At 5:30 a.m., Diana made a call to the police. As soon as Sergeant Dick Lendrum of the Sydney PD caught wind of what had happened to Dr. Yates, he phoned Detective Raymond Benson.
Sergeant?
So, the station already called you?
Yeah, some housewife found her husband dead in the garage.
It's Dr. Jim Yates, a surgeon. One of the best ones in Sydney.
Oh, fantastic. I give it an hour before the scene is crawling with press.
Save the attitude, Benson. We need this one done right. And you're right about the journos. His wife was the one who found him dead, so they're gonna be flocking to this one. But play nice this time, got it? Meet me there in 30.
Yeah, I'll be there.
Detective Benson was as seasoned as they come, and his lauded career was defined by a no-nonsense approach to police work. As far as he was concerned, anyone at the scene of the crime who wasn't a fellow officer was a distraction. He arrived at the Yates home, and much to his dismay, reporters and photographers from the local paper, the Daily Mirror, had already begun to swarm.
Just as he was known to do, Benson spared the pleasantries and dove right in. He headed straight to his sergeant to find out if he had gathered any more information about Yates' untimely death.
You talked to the wife yet?
She's real cagey. It's a bit odd, to be honest. We hadn't asked her more than 2 questions before she requested a lawyer.
What? A housewife just found her husband dead on the ground, and she's asking for a lawyer?
It's strange, that's for sure. We managed to talk her down from that ledge, but as soon as we got past that, she started bawling and said she was too upset to talk. It's understandable, I suppose.
I suppose. Let's go take a closer look at the body.
While Lendrum debriefed Benson, another rival newspaper team had gathered outside the Yates house.
He screamed at them to back up and looked as though he might launch right into the lot of them. Luckily, a few other officers were at the ready to talk him down and de-escalate the situation.
After Benson took a second to compose himself, he and Lendrum walked into the garage. Armed with lamps in the light of the sun, Jim Yates' body was on full display.
His bloodied and colorless body was starkly contrasted by the smears of blood that stained his hands and the concrete around him. The gash on his forehead was deep and jagged and led directly up to the fracture on his skull.
Most interestingly, a broken light bulb lay only inches away from Yates' body. This could have all been chalked up to an accidental slip while trying to replace it. However, the gratuitous wounds inflicted on the body told a different story, and for a detective as meticulous as Lendrum, the story meant everything.
Unsure of what to make of it all, they went inside the house to try and talk with Diana Yeates. Lendrum and Benson followed a quaint pebble pathway that led to a small home that overlooked the bay. Inside was Diana, her hair pulled back tightly and her eyes glazed over. To the officers, she looked more disheveled and nervous than grief-stricken.
Sitting on either side of her was her brother, David Dickens, and the family doctor. Diana insisted that both of them sit with her while the police questioned her. The detectives were apprehensive but obliged. Not to mention, it didn't hurt having 2 more witnesses at their disposal.
Diana gave a curt retelling of the events that led up to her finding Jim's body. Her statement was not particularly enlightening. However, something about David caught the detective's attention.
Mrs. Yates, we found a shattered light bulb on the garage floor next to your husband's body. Were you aware of this?
Yes, when I first found him, I did notice that.
Do you have any idea why it might have been there?
I suppose not.
Well, Jim was always using this rickety old ladder to replace the light bulb. That's what you were telling me, right, Diana? He almost fell right on his face several times. Or that's what you had told me earlier this morning.
Oh, right, yes. That is true. I'm sure he was just in the garage changing the bulb out.
Right. Okay, David, we'll get to you shortly.
Of course. I just wanted to make sure Diana and I can be as helpful to you two upstanding officers as possible.
Benson and Lendrum took careful note of David's frequent interruptions. It was as if he was trying to get his sister to stay on script. But by now, almost 2 hours had passed since they first arrived on the scene, and they still had no leads.
So they left the house and returned to the garage to take another look at the body. Once more, Detective Benson was down on his haunches, meticulously scanning the room for anything that could help him make sense of the situation.
But every angle, every inch, every vantage point brought him no answers. Here was this body riddled with brutal injuries and blood everywhere, yet not a single weapon or sign of forced entry to be seen.
Jim still had his wallet on him, and Diana confirmed nothing was missing from the garage or the house, so robbery was out of the question. That meant he likely had to have been targeted, but there were few surgeons in Sydney with such a spotless personal record. He was beloved by co-workers, neighbors, and just about everyone who knew him.
Benson was trying to think of some new angle when something caught his eye. 2 tiny specks of red on the upper left section of Dr. Yates' shirt. He hunched down even further to get a closer look.
Lendrum, get over here.
What is it?
You see it? Bloodstains, right above the heart.
Nicely done, Detective. Wait, Benson, don't touch the body.
I'm not waiting around another second. Oh my God. Do you see it? Tell me you see it.
Yeah, right there, I see it. A small wound.
Straight into the heart.
A few minutes after the shocking discovery, a government medical official arrived on the scene to inspect the body. The detectives immediately asked him to look at the wound. It was hard to tell exactly what it was, but after examining it with a magnifying glass, the doctor had a pretty good guess.
So, what do you make of all this?
Well, it seems to me that this is a puncture wound, one that looks incredibly consistent with that of a hypodermic needle.
Like, a shot?
Detectives, I believe that someone administered an injection to Mr. Yates, not long before he died.
Benson took a long draw of his cigarette as he let this revelatory discovery wash over him. In the blink of an eye, this went from yet another frustrating and slow case to one of the most intriguing and strange investigations he had ever worked on.
But most importantly, as far as Benson was concerned, this was no longer just another case. This was a murder.
Coming up, the detectives look far and wide for suspects, and Diana Yeates starts to crack.
After a grueling morning trying to make sense of Dr. Jim Yates' death on September 14th, 1960, detectives Ray Benson and Dick Lendrum finally caught a break. Just above the dead man's heart was a small puncture wound, one that they believed was caused by an injection from a hypodermic needle.
Soon after this discovery, Yates' body was moved to the morgue. Benson and Lendrum made sure the coroner paid careful attention to the alleged injection point.
And after almost an hour of scrupulous measuring, testing, and inspecting, the detectives were delighted to hear that their hunch was confirmed. This was indeed a wound that could have only come from a needle point. But the coroner had more news.
You said there was a doctor on the scene of the crime, correct?
That's right. He was the family's practitioner. Why do you ask?
Do you have any reason to believe that he tried to resuscitate Mr. Yates when he arrived?
No, he was long dead by the time the doctor arrived.
Well, I can't be certain, but there are various signs that this man was administered a rather large dosage of adrenaline at some point before his death. A potentially lethal dose.
While Lendrum and Benson stood in awe of their newest discovery, the world found out about the untimely death of Jim Yates.
Just about every paper in Sydney published a picture of the tall doctor, standing proudly and wearing his favorite pork pie hat, paired with the headline, "Doctor Found Dead in Garage."
The newspapers weren't reporting it as a murder yet, but as far as the police were concerned, there was no doubt.
And although the general public only had scant details to make sense of what had happened, it was a devastating blow to the medical community. Jim Yates was a pillar of Sydney Hospital. So much so that the hospital's superintendent, Dr. Norman Rose, insisted on fielding each and every press inquiry about Jim personally, of which there were dozens.
So, you knew Jim Yates well?
Absolutely. He worked under me for years. One of the hospital's finest surgeons. One of the finest I've ever seen. The man was beyond dedicated. Studied in London at the Royal College of Surgeons. Served as a medical official in the Middle East. He was even decorated for his medical service in New Guinea during the Pacific War.
He seems like a wonderful man. Now, I have to ask, just because there's been some gossip, but would you say that Dr. Yates had any enemies at the hospital?
Enemies? Absolutely not. Jim was adored by all. What are they saying?
Well, some people have gotten the idea that maybe Jim was murdered.
I do not see how that would be possible. At least not at the hand of anyone employed by this hospital. I can guarantee you that.
Word of Jim's alleged murder was spreading rapidly both inside the hospital and throughout the rumor mill in downtown Sydney. The detectives knew all too well that if rumors got out of hand, the case could be compromised, so the pressure was on.
On September 16, 1960, the day after Jim was found dead, they headed back to the Yates house to have another word with Diana. Just like last time, her brother was practically glued to her hip during the entirety of their interview. As they conducted their questioning, they couldn't help but notice that the two of them were acting even stranger than last time.
After your husband's autopsy, we were able to discover a wound in his chest that's consistent with a puncture wound from a needle. Did you or your brother inject him with anything after finding his body?
Dear God, no! That's absurd!
Please don't take it personally. We have to ask.
Absolutely not.
Well, if that's the case, then it is our duty to inform you that it's the opinion of the North South Wales Criminal Investigation Branch that your husband's death was the result of foul play. We'll be launching a full investigation into his murder, and we'll need full statements from the both of you.
What? That's absurd! I'm telling you, if you knew Jim, you would know how sloppy he got with that ladder!
He's right. If only you knew Jim.
I'm afraid that's just not how we see it.
We're gonna need to get in touch with our lawyer.
This is purely routine. There's really no need to...
Detectives, not another word until we have our lawyers.
Their lawyer arrived shortly thereafter and cut the meeting short. The detectives would have to wait for Diana and David's statements, but at that point, it was irrelevant. Their behavior over the past 2 days was reason enough to think that the two of them were involved in Jim's death in one way or another. Now it was just about figuring out how and why.
But just as the detectives felt as though they were getting closer to an answer, they received some news from the coroner that made them reconsider everything.
After spending more time inspecting Yates' heart and the trajectory of the puncture wound, it became clear that whoever administered the injection knew exactly what they were doing. It went straight to the heart with surgical precision. Yates' killer was most likely a fellow medical professional.
That same afternoon, only a few hours after leaving the Yates home, Detective Lendrum got a call that would change the entire trajectory of the case. It was from another doctor at Sydney Hospital, one who knew Jim Yates very well.
This is Sergeant Lendrum. May I ask who's calling?
Hello. My name is Dr. Eric Hedberg. You're heading up the Yates investigation, right?
That's correct. Are you a relative or friend of the deceased?
Coworker. And friend. Our families knew each other very well, actually. I was hoping we could speak.
Yes, of course, but just quickly, you knew Yates outside of the hospital?
That's correct. He and I go way back many years. Our wives were also friends. My wife passed, but when she was still with us, her and Diana were very close.
Diana, right. What was your relationship with her like?
Oh, right. We were, friendly, I suppose. So you said we could meet somewhere then?
Yes, that's fine. Meet me at the Rose Bay Marina in 1 hour.
As Sergeant Lendrum sat in the police cruiser on his way to the marina, he thought of all the cases where he'd spent weeks searching for a killer. But today, it seemed that the murderer might have come to him.
When Lendrum met his man, 47-year-old Dr. Eric Hedberg looked like the last person you'd ever expect to be a murderer. He was tall, handsome, and had a wholesome glint in his eyes. He was a decorated veteran, senior surgeon, and a widower. If this was Lendrum's man, he was going to need some compelling evidence. Otherwise, there was no way anyone at the station would buy it.
The two got to speaking, and according to Hedberg, he simply called the detective so he could be of service to the investigation. Albeit disappointed that this was not a confession, Lendrum did find Hedberg to be a useful well of information on Jim's past. However, Hedberg's behavior towards the end of the conversation brought the sergeant pause.
I know you and Yates were close, so this might be difficult for you to hear, but we have reason to believe that he was murdered. We found a small puncture wound near his heart, and we believe someone administered a lethal injection of some sort.
Oh, that's... I mean, a needle point like that seems difficult to even identify. How can you be certain?
We had a trusted government official go over the body several times. We've even cross-referenced everything with doctors at the hospital where you work. Everyone agrees.
Well, that's certainly odd. A small puncture wound to the heart shouldn't even cause much harm. I doubt that's what killed James.
We're fairly certain it is. We have reason to believe he was given a dose of adrenaline. Do you know if Jim or anyone close to him may have had access to adrenaline?
Ha! That's preposterous. Surgeons of our caliber would never use anything like that. Likely some petty criminal, if anything at all.
Right.
Following this conversation, Lendrum immediately had his officers do extensive background checks on Dr. Hedberg. The way he had reacted to the fact that police believed Jim was murdered was a massive red flag. His defensiveness, the way he rushed and stumbled through his words, the sweat that visibly collected on his brow. Lendrum had seen it all before, and he knew that Hedberg was hiding something.
And 4 days later, he would receive yet another call from Hedberg that only made his suspicions intensify.
Coming up, Dr. Eric Hedberg scrambles to defend his innocence. And now, back to our story.
In September of 1960, detectives Roy Benson and Dick Lendrum of the Sydney Police were making fast work of the Jim Yates case. Only 1 day after the body of the 50-year-old surgeon was found in his garage, the detectives were able to surmise that Jim was administered some sort of lethal injection. Now, they just needed to figure out who did it.
And Lendrum had a pretty good idea of who that was. Although Dr. Hedberg claimed to be a longtime friend of both Jim and his family, the detective had his suspicions.
The second that Lendrum revealed that Jim's death was now being investigated as a murder, Hedberg's entire disposition changed. The once charming and confident doctor grew withdrawn and shaky.
Lendrum considered having some officers keep an eye on Hedberg's car and house, thinking that he might have the inclination to leave town after his disastrous interview.
However, much to Lendrum's surprise, Hedberg showed up at his office 4 days later. He had a confession to make, but not quite the one the detective was expecting.
can't believe it. That's the guy. The one from the Yates case. Okay, stay close by and write down everything he says. Got it?
Yes, Sergeant.
Dr. Hedberg, what a surprise. Please, take a seat.
Yes, hello. I have some information that could potentially be useful to the investigation. You see, I completely forgot to mention it the other day, but I had actually purchased some vials of adrenaline last week.
Is that right? And do you think that is somehow connected to the adrenaline that killed Yates?
That's the thing. The adrenaline was actually stolen out of my car. And, well, considering my ties to Jim and his family, I believe I'm being framed. Someone clearly wants to destroy me, whether it be for professional reasons or otherwise. Maybe a co-worker at the hospital.
Is there anyone at the hospital that you think would be capable of committing such a heinous crime?
No. But, well, you never know these days. Could be anyone, I suppose. Isn't it funny? The guy who is going out of his way to try and be as useful as possible to the case is the one who ends up getting framed. Life is funny like that, isn't it?
It sure is.
Dr. Hedberg then launched into a barely coherent theory of just how the vials were stolen from his car and how the murder was carried out. Lendrum didn't believe a word of it. As far as he could tell, Hedberg knew he was a suspect and was scrambling to cover his tracks as best he could.
But still, even though Lendrum believed with every fiber of his being that Hedberg was at least somehow involved with Yates's death, there wasn't enough evidence to arrest him just yet. So he linked back up with Benson and headed to Sydney Hospital.
Their only piece of concrete information was that the puncture wound that killed Yates was made with the precision of a trained medical professional. So they conducted interviews with nearly 100 of the hospital's employees.
Most of it left the two detectives none the wiser, but one cardiologist did have something to offer. During a board meeting that took place around 9 p.m. the evening of the murder, Jim Yates received a phone call. Jim told the witness that the caller had asked when he'd be home. The witness didn't remember who had called, but he did remember that the caller was a man.
Lendrum and Benson had a few more questions to ask this witness.
Was Dr. Hedberg at that same meeting?
Eric? Well, funny you mention it. He was, but he actually took off just before then. Maybe at 8:45?
Just enough time for him to make it to the house. He called, waited outside the house, then struck.
Wait, what? Dr. Hedberg? You couldn't possibly...
No, of course not. Lendrum is just speaking in hypotheticals.
After that, every hospital employee that was called in was questioned about Dr. Hedberg's relationship to Jim Yates. Unfortunately, most of these testimonies offered little information that helped the detectives.
However, the next day, everything was about to change. The sister of Hedberg's deceased wife, Patsy Wilson, had just arrived in town, and she wanted to speak to the police about her brother-in-law. The next day, she had Lendrum and Benson come to her hotel.
I saw the news about Jim in the paper a few days back. As soon as I saw it, I knew I had to come down here.
What's the connection here?
Eric, that foul man. He always had eyes for Diana.
Whoa. Are you telling me they had an affair?
Oh, I'm sure of it. He even wrote a letter about it all to poor Joyce before she passed. But he destroyed it.
I knew it! I could smell it on him. He's our man, Benson.
Not so fast. You're accusing a man of murder here.
Wouldn't be the first time.
Patsy told the detectives that when her sister initially fell sick with cancer, Hedberg administered treatment to her in their house, a practice that was illegal and very frowned upon in the medical community. No one knew but close family.
After the supposed treatment, Joyce fell unconscious. When she awoke, she couldn't walk and she couldn't keep a bite of food down. Then the chest pain started. Several days later, she was admitted to the hospital after having a heart attack.
Joyce confided to her sister that she believed Hedberg was trying to poison her. Her death came abruptly only a few weeks later. As far as Patsy was concerned, this was all orchestrated by Hedberg. The thought that he was capable of killing again was by no means a long shot.
And Patsy wasn't the only one who thought so. Lindrum and Benson had heard more than enough to send them on the warpath to convict both Hedberg and Diana. But while this was all happening, Diana was hiring a new lawyer, one that would make the two of them nearly untouchable.
It seemed as though every time the police got a lead, Diana and Hedberg were 3 steps ahead of them. In just 3 months, the story of the doctor murdered by his wife's lover would be on the front page of every newspaper in Australia. Hundreds would line up outside the courtroom where the two would be tried for murder. But nothing could prepare the public nor the police for the onslaught of secrets, betrayals, and injustices to come. A bustling crowd gathered outside Sydney's Central Criminal Court on the morning of December 7th, 1960. Photographers from just about every newspaper in town waited at the court gates, flashbulbs ready to fire at a moment's notice.
Promptly at 10, the mass of people went from a stagnant group to an absolute frenzy. At a passing glance, you'd think this was the arrival of some celebrity or politician. But no, it was a middle-aged kindergarten teacher named Diana Yeates.
She walked with her head held high and her lawyer attached at the hip. Everyone followed her slim silhouette until it disappeared behind the courtroom doors. But then another car pulled up, and once more the crowd erupted.
This time it was a man, Dr. Eric Hedberg. He stood at a towering 6'4", and his wavy brown hair was slicked back perfectly. 3 lawyers followed him closely, and he hardly showed any recognition to the swarm that screamed out his name. He kept his eyes glued straight ahead and was out of sight within seconds.
As soon as he was away from the crowd, he felt a wave of anxiety surge over him. He was a professional man, a surgeon, a father, and yet he was about to stand trial for murder.
He saw Diana waiting by the courtroom doors and nodded solemnly. He knew she must be feeling similarly. As far as the police and much of the general public were concerned, Diana Yeates was his accomplice.
Hedberg patted the sweat away from his forehead and combed back his hair. But it didn't matter how poised he appeared. All that mattered now was whether the jury thought that he was capable of murdering his close friend and colleague, Dr. Jim Yates. This is our second episode on the murder of Dr. Jim Yates. Last week, we examined how a normal household accident turned into a mysterious murder case. This week, we'll cover the murder trial of Jim Yates' wife and her potential paramour, Dr. Eric Hedberg.
We have all that and more coming up. Stay with us.
On September 24th, 1960, Detective Ray Benson showed up unannounced to the home of Diana Yeates. Just a week and a half earlier, Diana's husband, Jim, was found dead in the family's garage. As Benson and his colleagues dug further into the case, they began to realize that something much more complicated was afoot.
And every twist and turn in the case seemed to lead right back to Diana Yeates. It also led to the man that the police were currently considering their prime suspect, Dr. Eric Hedberg.
Hedberg was a friend and co-worker of Jim Yates, and according to a number of different sources, he and Diana had been engaged in an affair for quite some time. So Benson sought answers. However, he didn't quite get what he was looking for.
Hello, Miss Yates? Is that you? I can hardly see you.
Yes, well, my lawyer gave me strict instructions on how to proceed with all this. I really shouldn't even be talking to you right now.
We already went over this. You have nothing to worry about. We just want to find out what happened to Jim.
I'm not allowed to say anything. Or let you in. I better call him now.
Miss Yates, please. That's not necessary.
30 minutes later, a town car pulled up outside of the Yates home. A tall and handsome man with jet black hair stepped out and greeted the detective. He happily ushered Benson inside the home.
This wasn't just any lawyer. This was Stanley Howard. In Sydney, he was the lawyer. And as soon as Benson saw him flash that toothy grin, he knew that this case was going to drag on for a lot longer than he had hoped.
Now, Miss Yates, I have a few questions about...
I'm so sorry, officer, but my client will not be answering any questions this afternoon.
Diana, come on. You want to help us, right? This is all just to help your husband.
Is there anything else?
So, Miss Yates, correct me if I'm wrong, but you are refusing to cooperate with the police. Is that right?
Not cooperating? This is the 4th time you've called upon my client to relive some deeply traumatic events. She has let you in her home and has been nothing but civil. How exactly is she not cooperating, Detective?
Diana, you're better than this.
That'll be all.
While Benson was trying to plan his next move, his partner, Lieutenant Dick Lindrum, was across town at the Bank of New South Wales.
The bank manager and 2 employees escorted the detective into a room where he was handed the late Joyce Hedberg's safety deposit box. And nothing could prepare him for what he found inside.
First, Lindrum uncovered an envelope marked Letter to Diana Yeates, written by Eric Hedberg, 1959. The detective almost started shaking with anticipation as he peeled back the adhesive and opened the letter.
Anticipating some declaration of love or plea for divorce, Lindrum was shocked when he discovered that Hedberg had taken this opportunity to express himself in a more artistic manner. It was a poem.
Saddest of all to love and be loved, and yet to be parted, to see both pillars of a soaring arch forced apart by circumstance, each to weather, to waste in sight of each. This is the final misery. Is there not some secret word, some charm, some mystic right to save what never will occur again?
Lindrum couldn't help but laugh. There was something undeniably absurd about this esteemed surgeon penning love poems to his colleague's wife. It was like something out of a soap opera.
But what he discovered next brought him back down to earth and reminded the detective that this situation was all too real.
Beneath a mess of old pay stubs and passport photos were 2 copies of the late Joyce Hedberg's will. One was dated July 1953, the other October 1959. The biggest difference was that the latter one had left out Eric Hedberg entirely.
Neither of these documents directly implicated Hedberg in anything criminal. However, they strongly supported the theory that he was having an affair with Diana Yeates. The 2 wills were evidence that he and his wife had a falling out near the time of her death. And as far as the police were concerned, this was a massive win.
While the papers reported that the Yates case was having little to no movement, those in the know at the Sydney Police Department were grinning ear to ear. If things kept up at this rate, they'd have Hedberg convicted in no time.
In fact, the case was getting so hot that it began attracting attention from one of the department's most promising up-and-coming detectives, Ray Kelly. Lindrum and Benson were seasoned and methodical, but if they were veteran marathon runners, then Kelly was a sprinter.
He went over Benson and Lindrum's heads and managed to get put on the case. He spared no hesitation diving in. Once word spread that he was getting involved in the Yates case, the press took notice.
On September 28th, local newspapers published articles discussing how the hotshot detective would be breathing some much-needed life into the investigation. His main task would be getting a confession out of the mystery doctor who held the key to this baffling murder.
That morning, Kelly walked into the station with his head held high. He was going to go for gold. No rounds through the hospital, questioning nurses and doctors. The due diligence stopped here. He was going to get Hedberg in a room and not leave until he had a confession.
However, Benson and Lendrum were waiting for him outside his office. They were about to take the wind out of his sails.
You have any idea what you've done, Kelly?
If you'd get out of the way and let me into my office, I might just save this case. If you don't mind.
I think you've done the opposite. We got a wire from both lawyers, Hedberg's and the Yates family. They read about the new detective in the papers.
About how he always gets his man? How he'll go to any extreme?
And now, neither suspect is willing to meet with the police. We're being completely stonewalled.
Oh, come on. Like either of them were cooperating in the first place.
It doesn't matter, Kelly. We had a chance. They were at least willing to be in the same room as us. Now we won't be seeing either of their faces unless this thing goes to court.
Or unless we find enough evidence to arrest that Hedberg scumbag.
This isn't some TV show. There's no smoking gun. That's never going to happen. And the only chance we had was getting Yates or Hedberg into the station to get a confession. Now that is never going to happen.
Just as the case started heating back up, it went completely cold. It was a heavy blow. The detectives were going to have to find an entirely different angle if they were to regain momentum.
Not to mention, the frustration was eating away at Lendrum and Benson. As a result, one of the two was about to make an impulsive decision that would mar their professional reputation forever.
Coming up, a rift forms between Detectives Benson and Lendrum, and the Yates inquest begins.
By the end of September 1960, the investigation into the murder of Dr. Jim Yates was starting to take a toll on detectives Ray Benson and Dick Lendrum. It seemed as though every step forward was met with several steps back.
Lendrum had almost a decade on Benson, so he was used to this sort of unpredictable pace. But Benson, not only less experienced than his partner, but also far more erratic and ill-tempered, didn't have such an easy go of it.
After Eric Hedberg and Diana Yeates both decided to withhold any further cooperation with the police, Benson started to crack.
This isn't to say he stopped working the case, but his energy shifted dramatically from dedicated to unhinged. And so it came as no surprise to his fellow officers that his reaction to the latest development in the investigation was a bit overblown.
Hey, Benson, you might want to hear this.
What is it? Hedberg? Diana? Something about the will?
Not quite, but we got a hold of Joyce Hedberg's death certificate, and something isn't quite checking out.
I don't have all day. Spit it out.
Well, the doctor who signed the certificate, we called him up, and he claims to have never inspected the body.
So you're telling me the certificate might be a fake? Hedberg could have forged the signature himself?
That's a bit of a stretch. We could give the funeral parlor a call and—
What's it matter? The man is a murderer, plain and simple. Now, I might be the only one around here who sees it, but I'm not going to wait around for him to kill a third time. Come on, we're putting an end to this.
What? This is hardly probable cause.
Are you denying your superior? You want me to write you up for insubordination? Now get in the cruiser.
Benson and the officer piled into the car and took off speeding towards Sydney Hospital. They were going to place the doctor under arrest for the murder of Joyce Hedberg and Jim Yates.
However, once word circulated of Benson's hasty and unprofessional course of action, Detective Lendrum dropped everything.
Benson, what on earth do you think you're doing?
I'm solving this case. You know Hedberg is guilty as well as I do.
Is this some sort of joke? Benson, you turn that car around this second or you're going to get kicked off the force. Is that what you want?
Enough beating around the bush. We're treating these monsters like children. No more due diligence, no more snooping around the hospitals. I mean, Dick, come on. The man killed his wife.
I am with you, trust me. I know a guilty man when I see one, and Eric Hedberg is as guilty as they come. But this isn't how this works. Plus, we're not investigating the murder of his wife. Come on, you know it as well as I do. This is only going to set us back. Turn the car around, Benson.
Benson did as he was told, and while Lendrum was able to sympathize with his exhausted and enraged partner, this sort of behavior was unacceptable. He kept the incident from his supervisor, but he knew that keeping him on the case in the same capacity would put the entire investigation in jeopardy.
From that moment on, Benson was kept at arm's length. Despite the hiccup, the officers remained focused and continued digging. And on October 4th, Detective Lendrum was called to Sydney University's pharmacology department to discuss an exciting new development.
Ah, Detective Lendrum. Please, take a seat.
Give me some good news, Professor. You have no idea how dearly we all need it.
Well, you're in luck, my friend. We took several tissue samples from Dr. Yeates' heart and found 5 distinct locations where there is an abnormal presence.
Adrenaline?
Adrenaline. Expertly administered adrenaline, and an objectively lethal amount. The fact that 280 micrograms remained in the tissue after all this time indicates that whoever did this to the doctor was trying to hurt him. No two ways about it.
While it did not tie directly to Dr. Hedberg, this was objective proof that Jim Yates was murdered. And in the veritable ocean of hearsay evidence that the detectives had been wading in, that meant a tremendous amount.
The next day, the police chief held a meeting to discuss all the new findings in the Yates case. Lendrum stood proudly and presented his findings to a very pleased room. But he wasn't the only one with an exciting break in the case.
Another officer working the case had decided to stop by and have another chat with Patsy Wilson, Joyce Hedberg's sister. He briefed her on the latest with the case, but one detail jumped out at her.
Dr. Hedberg had come to the station weeks earlier to explain that he had actually purchased adrenaline that was later stolen from his car days before Yates' death. He said the reason he had purchased vials of the medication was to treat his son's asthma.
But according to Patsy, her nephew did not have asthma. She was sure of it. The officer then contacted Hedberg's family physician to confirm the claim, and the pile of incriminating evidence continued to grow.
The conference room where the detectives gathered was bubbling over with energy and merriment. However, there was one person whose absence could not be ignored. Benson sat just a few feet away, stewing with resentment as the case moved forward without him.
Later that night, Jack Whelan, a fellow detective, invited Benson out for a beer at a local hotel bar.
But Benson seethed at the bar, downing pint after pint. Whelan realized Benson was drunkenly moping, and, no stranger to his fiery temper, decided to make sure the evening wasn't going to take a turn for the worse.
Save some for the fishes, Benson.
I could have had him, you know. It would have all been so simple. Just sat Hedberg down, fed him something about how he was trying to do what he needed for the woman he loved, how good of a mother Diana could have been, how a few years in jail is better than life, and boom! Would have confessed on the spot.
I know, Ray, we all do. No one thinks any less of you. Everyone on the force has had moments when all the procedure, the waiting, the playing dumb, it all gets to be too much. Even Lendrum.
Yeah. I'd be surprised if the old man even cares about keeping people like Hedberg off the streets. He just wants the credit.
You know you'd better find a way to play nice. You'll be hitting the stand soon. You bring that attitude with you into the courtroom, and no good will come of it. Stay out of trouble, detective.
Benson woke up the next morning with a nasty hangover, but more importantly, a renewed sense of understanding. He was no stranger to the fact that this job wasn't always the most validating, and Whelan was right. The coroner had just set aside a week in December for the Yates inquest at the Central Criminal Court in Sydney.
Within just a month's time, it no longer mattered what Lendrum or Benson thought. It would be up to the jury to decide whether Eric Hedberg would remain a free man.
Coming up, the inquest into the murder of Dr. Jim Yates begins. And now, back to the story.
The coroner's inquiry began on December 7th, 1960. It had only been 3 months since Dr. Jim Yates was found dead. But to those pulled into the investigation's current, it felt like a lifetime.
Eric Hedberg and Diana Yeates made their way into the courtroom by 10 that morning. Each was wearing their finest clothing and did not have a single hair out of place. But under the fluorescent lights of the court, both looked as though they had been up for days on end.
The Yates murder had been at the forefront of local media for months, and all the key players were tantamount to local celebrities. Everyone in the room was so distracted by the infamous Dr. Hedberg and the unfaithful Diana Yeates, they were caught off guard once court was called into session.
The first day began with Detective Alan Clark being called to the stand. He had been one of the first officers to arrive at the scene of Jim Yates' murder. Over the next 10 minutes, he detailed what he saw on September 14th, and he spared no gruesome detail. Clark described how Yates' scalp and hands were caked with blood.
As Clark continued, Diana seemed to be holding her breath, and as if that first day in court seemed like it couldn't get any more difficult for Mrs. Yates, numerous old friends and cohorts of Jim Yates were then called to the stand.
For the next 30 minutes, tales of Jim's bravery, selflessness, and professionalism took over the room. Whether it was in the operating room, the jungles of New Guinea during his time as a military medic, or just getting a pint with a friend, the man seemed to charm just about everyone he ever met.
The reporters and photographers that lined the walls of the courtroom kept their eyes glued on Eric Hedberg. As countless people sang the late doctor's praises, Hedberg's face remained without expression. His eyes seemed vacant.
Over the next few hours, multiple officers, including Detective Lendrum, explained the lack of cooperation from Diana Yeates and Eric Hedberg. Multiple times, Hedberg's lawyer asked if there was any evidence outside of hearsay that directly linked his client to the death of Jim Yates, and every time the answer was no.
Court adjourned at 1 in the afternoon. As the packed room filed out, a reporter couldn't help but notice Hedberg flash a furtive smile at Diana. 2 hours later, the inquest started back up.
Dick Lendrum sat in his seat and looked like a kid on Christmas as he noticed the judge studying an envelope. It was presented to the court as Exhibit 26, but Lendrum knew what it really was. He was called to the stand.
Detective Lendrum, can you explain to the court what exactly is in this envelope?
It is some sort of poem, Your Honor, written by Eric Hedberg.
Objection, Your Honor. There's no substantial proof that my client wrote that.
The poem in question was written by hand, and the document was cross-referenced with samples I obtained from Sydney Hospital that were written by Dr. Hedberg. The handwriting expert at the Criminal Investigation Branch concluded that both samples were written by the same person, Dr. Eric Hedberg.
Be that as it may, these documents are irrelevant to this hearing.
Respectfully, I disagree. I hereby admit this document as tenable evidence. Please carry on, Detective.
Lendrum did his best to use the piece of writing as proof of Hedberg's infidelity and lack of character. However, it ended up just endearing the doctor to the jury. He blushed and wiped sweat from his brow as the poem was read aloud, and audible giggles could be heard coming from the gallery. He seemed more like a lovesick teenager than a bitter murderer.
The day ended on an anticlimactic note, with no one knowing what direction the inquest was heading in, but both sides still had plenty of aces up their sleeves.
On December 9th, the second day of the trial, 3 people who had been crusading against Eric Hedberg met in person for the first time. Neil Yates, Patsy Smith, and one of Joyce's oldest friends, Freena Humphreys, shared an emotional introduction outside of the courtroom.
Before the day was called into session, the 3 recounted fond stories of their loved ones whom they believed had died at the hands of Hedberg. Right as they heard the first gavel bang, Patsy grabbed each of their hands.
Into battle. We're doing this for Joyce and Neil. We're doing this for Jim as well. My sister, your friend, your brother, it's all the same.
All three of them had tears welling in their eyes as they confidently walked into the courtroom. Frina was the first called to the stand. She talked at length about how her concern for Joyce grew and grew with each passing year that she remained married to Hedberg.
She remembered how insistent he was that he administer her treatment himself for various ailments. But each time, Joyce would emerge even sicker than ever, sometimes even unable to remain conscious. Frina's final statement was spent recalling how about a month after Joyce received her breast cancer diagnosis, Hedberg told her if it weren't for her illness, he would have left her right then and there.
Long gone was the innocent poetry-writing Eric Hedberg that the court sympathized with 2 days ago. Now they felt as though they were in the midst of a cold-hearted sociopath. Patsy stepped up next and continued the story right where Frina left off.
Joyce worried for years and years about her marriage. What kills me the most is that she loved Eric. She gave him everything, but it was never enough.
Not enough for what, Miss Smith?
Enough to get him to keep his eyes off of that awful woman, Diana. The two of them were at it for years, and that's not even the worst of it. What Frina said, it's all true.
Do you have any proof to back up this claim?
No, but you tell me how it looks, Your Honor. A cheating husband injects his nagging wife with some ungodly substance at home, and the next day she can't even keep her eyes open? She even has a heart attack. I mean, please, you just have to.
Patsy had become so fraught with emotion that she fainted right there in the witness stand. She regained consciousness quickly and didn't sustain any injuries, but it certainly made quite the statement. When court adjourned that day, those in Jim Yates' camp thought that they had Hedberg pinned in the corner.
However, as the inquest carried on, the flip-flopping did not cease. Even though there were a number of incriminating testimonies against Eric Hedberg and Diana Yeates, there was little to no physical evidence to back them up. It came down to one person's word against another.
Then, on the 11th day of the trial, on January 19th, 1961, things came to a head, and it left just about everyone in the courtroom completely stunned.
After hearing extensive coroner's reports, endless testimonies, and even reviewing some amateur poetry, the judge came to the conclusion that there simply was not enough compelling evidence to charge anyone with the murder of Dr. Jim Yates.
He agreed that this was indeed a murder, but the perpetrator was not in the courtroom. At least that was the picture painted by the evidence, or the lack thereof.
Upon hearing the ruling, neither Hedberg nor Diana seemed particularly happy, shocked, certainly, but the joyful sighs of relief that the people of the gallery were anticipating never came. In their place were somber looks of confusion and acceptance, almost as if a grave mistake had been made.
The two of them left the courtroom able to put this all behind them, but life did not return to normal for either Diana Yeates or Eric Hedberg.
Photographers were regularly positioned outside their places of work and homes to snap pictures for the local tabloids, as were people who weren't so happy with the verdict. Verbal harassment became a normal part of life.
In the spring of that year, the New South Wales government offered up a reward of 1,000 Australian pounds to anyone who could deliver information on who was responsible for the murder of Jim Yates. To Detectives Benson and Lendrum, this was a useless waste of government money. They knew exactly who killed him, and he was still a free man.
No real leads ever turned up. The government renewed the reward offer a few years later, but it was met with even less attention. It seemed as though the murder of Jim Yates had drifted into the background of cultural consciousness.
But the doctors who worked with him at Sydney Hospital, his 4 brothers, and the many who would never forget the murder of Jim Yates were in for a shock in May 1964.
Eric Hedberg and Diana Yeates were happily married in the rural Australian town of Oberon. A local newspaper wrote about the union and referred to the newlyweds as having been involved as witnesses in the murder case of an esteemed doctor some years ago. With all that in mind, I think Eric Hedberg is absolutely responsible for the murder of Jim Yates. Between his consistently faulty alibi and the fact that he was having an affair with Jim's wife, it all adds up.
While that may all be true, I don't think he's guilty of murdering his wife, Joyce. The testimonies of Patsy Smith and Frena Humphreys are compelling, but there is no further evidence that he had anything to do with her death other than speculation.
Regardless of who is to blame, Jim Yates was a man who dedicated his life to the well-being of others. And ultimately, regardless of their innocence, both Diana Yeates and Eric Hedberg betrayed him gravely.
A man whose spirit was as bright and kind as Jim should have been treated with far more respect by his close friend and spouse. But sadly, while he should be remembered for his time saving lives in the war and every day at Sydney Hospital, he will be immortalized on the ground of his garage with a hole in his heart.